There is a kind of prison so insidious, so perfectly constructed that its walls are invisible. You don't see the bars, you don't hear the doors close, but you feel it like a quiet suffocation. It's the prison of a mind that thinks it's free but isn't. A mind that confuses comfort with truth, agreement with clarity, and likes with value. And what makes it worse, most people don't even know they're trapped. They mistake the noise of the herd for their own thoughts. They confuse submission with virtue. And worst of all, they think the absence of resistance means peace. That's how modern control works. Not through violence, not through chains, but through architecture. Cultural, emotional, and psychological architecture. The kind that rewards obedience while disguising it as individuality. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this coming. Long before algorithms and social conditioning became sciences, Nietzsche warned of a world where the mind becomes its own jailer, where conformity is no longer enforced by others but voluntarily adopted by the self. He called this the triumph of herd morality, the slow decay of personal sovereignty under the weight of collective comfort. And in that warning lies the most uncomfortable truth of all. The average person does not want freedom. They want predictability. They don't want the responsibility that comes with choosing their own values. They want a manual. They want a blueprint. And that's why control thrives. But here's the paradox. The most dangerous kind of control is not the one imposed from the outside. It's the one that feels like a choice. When you think you're being authentic, but you're just following the script society handed you. When your thoughts are predictable, your desires engineered, and your rebellion perfectly marketable. So the question Nietzsche forces us to confront is this: what does it take to build a mind that can't be controlled? Not just a mind that rejects authority, but a mind that isn't silently owned by approval, applause, or avoidance of discomfort. In a world that conditions you to please obey and fit in, what does real mental sovereignty look like? Nietzsche didn't just ask these questions. He lived them. He walked away from institutions, endured madness, isolation, and rejection. Not out of bitterness, but because he knew that clarity comes at the price of popularity. And that real thought requires silence, solitude, and the courage to be disliked. This isn't a video about being edgy. It's about being awake. If you've ever felt like something is off, like your life is too curated, your opinions too safe, your thinking too borrowed, this is your sign to start over. Not by changing the world first, but by reclaiming the only territory you ever truly owned, your mind. Most people believe they're making choices. What to wear, what to post, what to believe. But Nietzsche would ask, are you really choosing? Or are you just selecting from a narrow menu that someone else handed you? The modern world has mastered the art of false freedom. You can pick your flavor, but not the recipe. You can question the surface, but not the foundation. This is not freedom. It's simulation. A carefully managed illusion that lets you feel empowered while keeping your mind under control. Nietzsche observed that the more a society promotes equality of opinion, the more it punishes depth of thought. We confuse access with understanding. We confuse the speed of information with the rigor of reflection. In the age of endless scrolling, people consume content not to think, but to distract themselves from thinking. And here's the disturbing twist. This isn't just happening to passive minds. Even intelligent, educated people, especially them, fall prey to this illusion. Why? Because the more data you consume, the more you think you're thinking, while actually outsourcing your mind to the collective noise. This is what Nietzsche meant when he warned against the last man, a creature of comfort and mediocrity, who avoids suffering at all costs. The last man doesn't ask questions that make life difficult. He doesn't rebel, not because he's too weak, but because he's too entertained. He feels a mild satisfaction with his safety, his screens, his social affirmations. He never risks offense, never seeks truth that costs him something. and yet he walks around thinking he's free. But Nietzsche wasn't cynical. He was ruthless in his clarity. He believed in the potential of a higher kind of person, someone who could wake up inside this matrix and build a self from scratch. Not a self shaped by trends, trauma, or ideology, but by will. He called this being the Übermensch, the overman, not someone above others, but someone beyond the programming. Someone who sees the lies not just in politics or religion, but in their own need to conform. And that's where sovereignty begins. It's not a flag you wave. It's a daily war inside your head, against the instinct to please, against the comfort of consensus, against the impulse to scroll away your responsibility to think. Nietzsche's warning was not just philosophical, it was prophetic. In an age where thoughts are manufactured and identities are commodified, mental sovereignty isn't just a nice idea, it's a survival skill. Ask the average person what freedom means, and they'll give you a slogan. Do what you want, say what you feel. But Nietzsche would argue that this definition is both shallow and dangerous. Real freedom is not indulgence. It's not the absence of limits. Real freedom is the terrifying privilege of responsibility of shaping your values, your direction, and your soul without asking for permission. This is why most people secretly hate freedom. They don't say it out loud, of course. They post quotes about it. They celebrate it in movies. But when it knocks on their door, demanding they choose between comfort and growth, between conformity and truth, they run. Because the burden of creating your own life is heavier than simply inheriting one. And Nietzsche saw this clearly. He knew that most people don't want to be free. They want to be safe. They want rules, heroes, ideologies, something to obey so they don't have to think too hard. So they don't have to feel the crushing weight of the question, what now? That's why Nietzsche's concept of the will to power is so misunderstood. People reduce it to ambition or domination. But at its core, it's about self-overcoming. It's about the inner strength to rise above external scripts and forge your own meaning, especially when no one applauds and everyone misunderstands. That's what makes sovereignty dangerous. Not because it threatens others, but because it exposes them. It holds up a mirror to those still sleepwalking and dares to ask, why are you still obeying? In a society addicted to external validation, mental sovereignty is rebellion. When you say no to what's popular, when you reject the ready-made narratives, when you take the risk of thinking for yourself, you don't just challenge the system, you threaten its very foundation. And that's why truly independent minds are often demonized. Not because they're wrong, but because they remind others of the freedom they're too afraid to claim. Nietzsche knew that the hardest chains to break are not political, they're psychological. The need to be liked, the fear of being alone, the addiction to comfort disguised as balance. He called for a new kind of human, someone who would walk away from the herd, not in anger, but in courage. Someone who would choose the anxiety of truth over the anesthesia of consensus. So, if you've ever felt the tension between what you believe and what you say, between what you desire and what society rewards, you're not broken. You're awake. And awakening is painful. But it's also the first step to sovereignty. What if the modern world wasn't built to liberate you, but to pacify you? Look around. Everything is more comfortable, more accessible, more entertaining. You don't need to think deeply, you have headlines. You don't need to feel lonely, you have endless notifications. You don't need to be strong, you can be endlessly accommodated. At first it seems like progress, but Nietzsche would see it differently. He'd see sedation. He warned us about comfort masquerading as happiness, because when life gets too easy, the muscles of the soul begin to atrophy. Discomfort, struggle, adversity. These aren't glitches in life. They're its crucible. Without them, the will to power fades. And Nietzsche feared that a society obsessed with comfort would produce individuals incapable of true freedom. Not because they're oppressed, but because they've willingly handed over their will in exchange for convenience. And that's the trap we're in today. The algorithms know what you want before you do. Your opinions are formed by curated content. Your values are shaped by what gets likes, not what's right. We've outsourced our thinking to machines and our dignity to trends. But Nietzsche understood mental sovereignty begins where dependency ends. As long as your sense of self is tethered to what's easy, what's popular, what's frictionless, you are not free. He believed that to be sovereign is to endure discomfort, mental, emotional, even existential. It's to resist the temptation to be numbed by routine or distracted by pleasure. It's to say no when the world says yes and yes when everyone else is afraid to. That kind of life is not easy, but it's real. This is why Nietzsche admired those who were willing to suffer for something greater. He didn't glorify pain for its own sake. He honored the clarity it brought, the way it burned off illusion and exposed truth. Because when you've walked through hell and kept your mind intact, no one can control you. And that's exactly what power structures fear a human being who cannot be seduced by comfort or silenced by fear. The modern world doesn't need to chain you to keep you weak. It just needs to keep you entertained. But if you can reclaim your capacity for discomfort, if you can see through the illusion of convenience, then you've already taken the first step back to sovereignty. Not the kind granted by others, but the kind earned in silence, forged in resistance, and owned without apology. You've probably heard it your whole life: follow the rules, don't make trouble, do what you're told. In school, obedience is praised. At work, conformity is rewarded. Even in social circles, there's pressure to think the same, feel the same, behave the same. And if you question the system, if you resist the norm, you're labeled as difficult, arrogant, even dangerous. But Nietzsche had a different name for this pattern: spiritual decay. He saw modern obedience not as a sign of virtue, but of decline. Because true virtue to him wasn't about fitting in, it was about standing alone when necessary. He believed that those who blindly follow inherited values without ever interrogating them have surrendered their inner compass. They are not living, they are merely existing under someone else's framework. And worse, they often pride themselves on their submission, mistaking passivity for goodness. In a world where external order is worshipped, internal chaos thrives. Think about it. How many people do you know who appear composed on the outside, but are miserable, confused, or directionless inside? That's the cost of outsourcing your will. Eventually, you lose it entirely. And when that happens, you become susceptible to manipulation. Not just from governments or corporations, but from anyone who offers certainty in exchange for compliance. Nietzsche believed that morality imposed from the outside was often a tool of control. He called it herd morality, a system that conditions people to value meekness, safety, and obedience above all else. Why? Because a population that questions nothing and obeys everything is easy to manage. But he didn't stop at critique. He offered an alternative. Become the creator of your own values. Not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. To Nietzsche, freedom wasn't about chaos, it was about responsibility. Creating your own values means taking full ownership of your life, your actions, your beliefs, your consequences. And that's terrifying for most people, because it removes the safety net. There's no one left to blame. No authority to fall back on, just you and the world and your choices. But in that terrifying space, something powerful is born: autonomy. And once you taste it, once you experience what it feels like to act from your own inner authority, rather than from borrowed beliefs, there's no going back. You see the rules not as sacred, but as negotiable. You stop asking for permission and start asking for truth. And that shift, that awakening, is what Nietzsche believed could restore our sovereignty. So the next time you feel the pull to obey without thinking, pause. Ask yourself, is this obedience a sign of strength or surrender? Because in a world that rewards quiet compliance, sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply say no. I choose differently. The modern world has engineered something astonishing, a life so comfortable, so predictable, and so numbing that it feels like safety. But Nietzsche warned, comfort is not the same as freedom. In fact, comfort might be the enemy of it. Because comfort doesn't just soften your body, it sedates your will. Think about the world we live in. We have apps to deliver our food content, to fill every spare second, and entire industries built around minimizing friction. Everything is optimized for ease. But in this smooth and polished world, where is the resistance? Where is the challenge that forces you to grow, to adapt, to evolve? Nietzsche called this the danger of decadence, a culture so obsessed with pleasure and convenience that it forgets how to struggle and eventually forgets how to live. Comfort seduces you with the illusion that things are fine as they are, that you don't need to push yourself, that avoiding discomfort is a form of intelligence. But here's the problem. Real strength is forged in discomfort. Sovereignty. True mental independence comes from engaging with difficulty, not avoiding it. And a life that's too easy becomes a trap. Because the more comfortable you are, the more terrified you become of anything that threatens that comfort. You stop asking hard questions. You stop taking real risks. You shrink. Nietzsche saw this happening in his own time, people trading their independence for security, their vitality for stability. He feared the rise of what he called the last man, a being who no longer dreams, no longer dares, but simply survives. Content with mediocrity, afraid of pain, distrustful of greatness. And if we're honest, we see the last man all around us. In the office that punishes innovation. In the school that rewards memorization over insight. In the society that tells you to be quiet, follow orders, and not rock the boat. But here's the hidden truth. Comfort is a cage with velvet walls. And the longer you stay inside, the more the door locks behind you, not with chains, but with habits. Convenience becomes dependence. Stability becomes stagnation. And soon, you're not choosing comfort. You're clinging to it, at the cost of your will. Nietzsche didn't argue for chaos or constant suffering. He argued for resistance, for choosing paths that make you stronger, not just happier, for embracing discomfort not because it's glamorous, but because it's honest. Because growth doesn't happen in the warm glow of convenience, it happens in the raw, unpredictable, sometimes painful space between who you are and who you could be. So ask yourself, what have you sacrificed for comfort? What ideas have you abandoned? What convictions have you diluted? What version of yourself have you locked away just to keep the peace? Because in the end, the mind that can't be controlled is the mind that refuses to be lulled to sleep by comfort. It's not brute force that keeps people docile anymore. It's fear. Quiet, sophisticated, internalized fear. Fear of discomfort. Fear of rejection. Fear of uncertainty. But most dangerously, fear of being different. And this is where control really takes root. Not in your actions, but in your avoidance. Nietzsche understood that fear more than violence or tyranny is the true tool of control. Because fear doesn't need a jail cell. It makes one inside your mind. And it starts early. You're taught to sit still, not speak out. Follow the rules, blend in. You're praised not for your boldness, but for your obedience. And slowly, your instinct to resist becomes an instinct to comply. Not because someone forced you, but because you feared the consequences of not doing so. This is what Nietzsche meant when he wrote that morality is the herd instinct in the individual. It's the internalized voice that says, don't think too deeply, Don't stand out. Don't question what everyone else accepts. It's not morality in the sense of goodness, but morality as a tool for conformity. It tells you that discomfort is wrong, that doubt is dangerous, that disobedience is selfish. It wraps fear in virtue, and most people swallow it whole. But here's the trap. The more you avoid discomfort, the more control fear has over you. The more you conform, the harder it is to think freely. And soon, you stop even noticing the leash around your neck. You just call it being realistic, being responsible, being good. You rationalize your own submission. Nietzsche wasn't heartless. He wasn't saying that fear should never exist. He was saying fear must never rule you. Because once fear becomes the default, you stop choosing. You start reacting. And when fear shapes your worldview, those who benefit from your silence no longer need to censor you, you'll censor yourself. This is what the modern world excels at. It doesn't burn books. It overwhelms you with information until you no longer know what's worth resisting. It doesn't forbid thought, it makes thought exhausting. It doesn't punish rebellion. It rewards silence. And the greatest trick, it convinces you that you chose it all, that your cage is your castle. To build a mind that can't be controlled, you must confront fear, not suppress it, but face it. You must learn to stand in discomfort without flinching, to be misunderstood without apology, to choose clarity over acceptance. Because every time you bow to fear, you strengthen the walls of your cage. But every time you resist, every time you act with courage in the presence of fear, you reclaim a piece of your sovereignty. Most people live in a constant state of reaction. Something happens, they respond. A comment, a headline, a notification. Ping, react, scroll. React, argue, react. They confuse activity with agency. But a sovereign mind doesn't react, it creates. It chooses its own pace, its own values, its own lens through which to see the world. Nietzsche warned against the reactive man, the one who only knows what he's against, never what he stands for. This man builds nothing. He simply resists what offends him. He's loud, but powerless. He's busy, but directionless. Sovereignty, in contrast, is creative. It's proactive. It's the deliberate shaping of thought, the conscious construction of meaning. It doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't need an enemy to justify its existence. And this kind of mental sovereignty must be cultivated. It doesn't happen by accident. It starts with stillness. You have to carve out space, mental and physical, where you're not being bombarded by noise. No screen, no feed, no urgent demand. Just you and your thoughts. At first it feels uncomfortable, even boring, but that's because your mind is detoxing from overstimulation. Stay with it. This space is where creation begins. From stillness, clarity emerges. You start noticing which ideas are yours and which were planted by others. You begin to discern what truly matters to you, not what you've been conditioned to care about. And with clarity comes courage. Because once you've identified what's truly yours, you'll start to protect it. You'll stop outsourcing your opinions, your priorities, your identity. But this isn't about becoming rigid or inflexible. A sovereign mind is not closed, it's just not gullible. It listens, but it filters. It adapts, but it doesn't abandon its core. It can change, but it won't be pushed. This is strength, not the brute strength of domination, but the refined strength of inner authority. The kind of strength that radiates even in silence. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch is often misunderstood. It wasn't about becoming superior to others. It was about transcending the conditioned self. The sovereign mind is the raw material of the Übermensch, the one who has turned his inner chaos into order, who no longer needs external validation to define his worth, and who lives according to a self-created ethos. This is not easy. It's not sexy. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a lifetime of decisions. Small, deliberate moments where you choose to think rather than react to act, rather than conform to create, rather than imitate. But with every moment like this, you fortify your sovereignty. You move from being a pawn on the board to the player who sees the entire game. And perhaps the most radical act of all, to protect your mind like a sacred space. To say I do not owe the world my outrage. I do not owe the crowd my agreement. I owe myself truth, clarity, and the courage to think without permission. Why is it that every major institution, governments, corporations, media, and even education subtly discourages independent thinking? Why do they reward compliance, repetition, and predictability, while punishing depth, nuance, and dissent because sovereign minds cannot be controlled? They cannot be marketed to as easily. They don't click impulsively. They don't follow orders blindly. They ask inconvenient questions. They delay judgment. They resist easy narratives. They take time, and in an economy of urgency and distraction, time is a threat. Nietzsche saw this clearly. He believed most morality wasn't rooted in truth, but in utility, specifically the utility of control. Systems flourish when people internalize their own oppression, when they mistake obedience for goodness, and when they believe their silence is a virtue. The sovereign mind dismantles this illusion. It doesn't rebel for the sake of rebellion, but it doesn't swallow the lie just because it's popular or profitable. That's why sovereign minds are often labeled as dangerous, not because they incite chaos, but because they don't need the system. They don't worship its idols. They're harder to manipulate, harder to shame, harder to seduce with empty promises. They're self-generating, like a fire that doesn't require gasoline. And this makes them fundamentally incompatible with mass control. Think about it. Public discourse today isn't designed to nurture reflection. It's designed to provoke reaction. News headlines aren't written to inform, they're designed to spark outrage. Social platforms don't reward truth, they reward virality and education. In too many places, it's no longer about cultivating wisdom, but about producing obedient, standardized outputs. In a world like this, sovereignty becomes subversion. When you start asking, what if this isn't true? Or who benefits if I believe this? You're already engaging in radical thought. You're pulling away from the default settings. And once you pull away even slightly, the entire structure starts to look different. You stop seeing the world as a series of demands and start seeing it as a terrain of choices. But be warned, systems don't just discourage sovereignty, they retaliate against it. Speak out too much and you'll be labeled arrogant. Question authority too often and you'll be called difficult. Choose to walk your own path and you'll be accused of selfishness or delusion. Sovereignty is lonely. That's part of its cost. But it's also what makes it powerful. Because once you've tasted mental freedom, the approval of the herd becomes meaningless. The sovereign mind doesn't escape the system entirely. That's a fantasy. But it navigates it differently. It participates selectively. It maintains boundaries. It plays the game without becoming the game. And in doing so, it becomes a quiet rebellion, not with slogans, but with silence. Not with anger, but with clarity. In a world that thrives on conformity, the sovereign mind is both a threat and a beacon. It reminds others sometimes, just by existing, that they too can choose, that they too can think for themselves, and that no algorithm, no institution, no ideology has the right to claim their soul. The question now becomes, how do we live this? How do we turn mental sovereignty from a concept into a way of being? Nietzsche never believed in passive insight. For him, knowledge that wasn't lived was worthless. To him, philosophy was not a lecture, it was a discipline, a training ground for the soul. And sovereignty in this light isn't a gift. It's a muscle. You either train it or you lose it. Start with refusal. Not loud performative rejection, but quiet internal discernment. Refuse to react immediately to every headline. Refuse to answer every message instantly. Refuse to adopt ideas just because they sound moral or progressive or right. In a world addicted to speed, your slowness becomes your strength. In a world that demands certainty, your doubt becomes your armor. Second, cultivate solitude. Not loneliness, but true mental space. Turn off the noise just long enough to hear your own mind again. You can't be sovereign if your thoughts are borrowed, if your desires are outsourced. You need silence, not just external, but internal. The kind of silence where your real questions rise. The kind of silence where the masks fall off. Third, stop outsourcing authority. Stop waiting for someone smarter, louder, or more confident to tell you what to believe. Sovereignty doesn't mean knowing everything. It means being responsible for how you decide. You can read thinkers you admire, but you can't worship them. Even Nietzsche isn't exempt. Question him. Question me. That's the point. Fourth, develop what Nietzsche called the yes-saying spirit. This isn't blind optimism, it's radical ownership. You don't just react to life, you affirm it. You choose your path, your risks, your consequences. You stop blaming the world for not handing you freedom, and you start carving it out, sometimes inch by inch, sometimes in a single brutal decision. Fifth, protect your attention like it's your soul, because it is. If your thoughts are hijacked every 10 seconds by notifications, opinions, or arguments you didn't ask for, your sovereignty is already compromised. Audit your inputs. Choose quality over quantity. Read thinkers who challenge you, not ones who flatter you. Spend more time creating than consuming. Reclaim the driver's seat of your mind. And finally, embrace the cost, because there will be one. Sovereignty isn't free. It might cost you belonging. It might cost you comfort. It might even cost you your sense of certainty. But what you gain is worth more than any of it. What you gain is the ability to look at yourself in the mirror and know you are not a puppet. You are not a slave to the mood of the crowd or the ideology of the weak. You are not programmable. You are a sovereign mind in an age of compliance. And that today is one of the most radical things a human being can be. Because the world doesn't need more loud voices. It doesn't need more smart opinions. It needs more people who are willing to slow down. Think deeply, resist the urge to conform, and live with a spine, mentally, morally, philosophically. Nietzsche didn't give us a rule book. He gave us a provocation to live not as echo chambers, but as original forces. To stand not on borrowed beliefs, but on forged convictions. To say no when everyone else says yes, and to do it without bitterness, just strength. Mental sovereignty isn't a destination, it's a practice. It's a series of daily defiant choices to stay awake in a world that profits from your sleep. Now, the question is, will you keep choosing it?